In 3ds Max, there is a second kind of deformation tool called a space warp. It's called so as it uses world space for the basis of its deformations. This is very different to the way modifiers work. A modifier pretty much always tries to tailor its effect to the single object, or in some cases, a group of objects that it's applied to. This means that a modifier will create a gizmo, which is the box that actually surrounds the object and basically which controls the effect of the modifier. And that gizmo is based on the bounding box of the current object or the objects that you have selected. And it will place the pivot point for the gizmo at the pivot point of the single object or in the geometric center of all of the objects that you currently have selected. This means that the deformation it produces will be closely matched to the geometry that you want to deform. So modifiers work best on single objects, but they can actually be used on large groups of objects if you need to. With a space warp, the deformed object's position or orientation doesn't really matter. The idea here is that you're creating an area of the world space that is actually deformed, and then any scene object that is linked to that space warp is deformed by it. You set up the space warp within world space, and then you bind the space warp to an object or objects to be deformed to the space warp using the bind to space warp button. Let's have a look at that now. Okay, so we need to go to the creation panel, and we need to click on the space warp buttons that you can see here. There are two main types of space warp that we're interested in here. And the reason why we're not interested in all of them is some of the space warps are actually based on particles, and they're also basically, these forces and deflectors are for particles. And as you can see, this particular section here is also for particles and dynamics. And this type of space warp is for use with reactor, which is a dynamic system in Max. So the two geometric deformation based space warp groups are geometric deformable and modifier based. And geometric deformable are distinct to the way modifiers work, but modifier based are called so because they're actually based on modifiers. So you've got a bend space warp, and you've also got a bend modifier. You've got a noise space warp, noise modifier, skew space warp, and skew modifier. I think you get the idea here. Let's go back to geometric deformable because these are the most distinct in terms of space warp difference. And what I'll do is I'll create an FFD box. So this is a freeform deformation lattice. And I'm just going to roughly place it in the scene. And then I'm going to use the type in dialog to type in some numbers. I'll just make it 100 by 100 by 100. And we know you can see the center of it is here. So what I want to do is actually just want to place it so it appears to sit on this grid here. So I'm just going to move it up here to this position. There we go. I think that's good enough. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create an object. We'll go for the teapot. As I said earlier, it's one of those things that may not seem to be the most obvious choice as a primitive. It is a complex object, and therefore it's a useful object to show how the deformation works. So I'll just increase the size of it a little bit here. And I'm going to put it inside this lattice to start off with. I'll just place it here. It's fine. And then I'm going to use the bind to space warp button, which you can see here. So I'm just going to, I've got the teapot already selected. I just need to drag and point to the space warp I want to bind it to. So now it's actually bound to that space warp, and you can see in the stack it's added a little option here, and it's what's called a world space modifier. So that gives you an idea what it does. That's why I described it as being acting on world space earlier. What we can do now is we can click on this on the actual space warp itself, go into its sub-object mode. So we'll go in and click on control points. And I can click any of these control points here and move them, and that will actually then deform the teapot. We'll just scrunch this in here. I'm not going to actually try and create anything, pretty. I'm just going to show you how this deformation system works. So we'll just deform it like that. And let's do some kind of scale on these here. So we'll actually pull them all in together here. And now I can go back and select the teapot. I can move it around. Just make sure I've got the teapot selected there. Yeah. I'll just rotate it slightly so it moves more along world space. And now when I move the teapot, you can see it's actually moving through the deformed space. And when it reaches the boundary of the space, you'll actually see that it's actually coming out of the space warp and it's not affected anymore. You've got a kind of linear cutoff there. I can move it here. Let's just move it through the field, the deformation field. And you can see as it heads towards this point, it gets scaled in here a lot. And then it pops out at the edge of the space warp and pops out here. That's basically a space warp for you. To make any object be affected by the space warp, you just need to bind the space warp to the object. So let's create some more objects. I'm just going to create a box here. And we'll keep this quite small. Just going to increase the tessellations on this box just so that it can actually be deformed nicely by the space warp. And let's create a tube. Drag this out here. And again, I'll give that some more tessellations so it's a little bit more deformable. It'll take on the deformations a little bit better. And again, we can use the bind to space warp button. And there we go. So you can see we've got them bound as well. And again, if I move these inside the deformation space, as you can see, the moment they enter it, they take part in the field, and you can see they get deformed quite nicely by that field. Just move that to there. Let's get the cylinder here. Sorry, the tube. Just pop it inside here. As you can see, it's getting deformed nicely as well. And the other cool thing you can do is you can actually grab the space warp itself and rotate it around. And as you can see, the objects get deformed by the deformation field. You know, it's as simple as that. So the big difference between a space warp and a modifier is that the space warp isn't based on local space and it's not tailored to these objects. It's an independent entity in itself. You can actually link this space warp to an object in the scene and it will move with it. So you can actually make it part of a hierarchy. So we can make another box here and we could get the space warp. And there we are, we've linked it in there. And now I can rotate this object and you can see that the space warp is part of its hierarchy. It's actually become a child of the box here. So it's an independent entity to any object in the scene, but you can actually link in objects and make them be affected by the space warp very easily, as I showed you using the bind to space warp button. This may not be as clear as it could be, so let me just show you the same kind of thing on an object using a modifier. So let's get a box, and we'll just create a box again. I'm going to go into modifiers, and let's find an FFD. Here we are. Let's go for a 4x4. And you can see when I create the FFD modifier, instead of it just being placed any old place in the world, it's actually designed to fit onto the box perfectly. You can see it's used the bounding box and it's used the pivot point of the box. So now I can go in, grab these control points, and start deforming the box. So the system kind of works in the same way as the Spacewarp FFD, but it's designed specifically to work on this object. And again, you know, that's not such a bad thing. But if you wanted to move this actual lattice, you can't link it to another object. There is actually a way to make it link to another object, but it's actually quite complex and it's not something we're going to be looking at on this DVD. But it's not easily linked to another object, and it's not designed as part of the main interface to allow you to do that. So it's not actually, you know, it doesn't have the same features as the FFD space warp, but you can actually, you know, link to an object, make part of a hierarchy, and so on and so forth. You know, it's not an independent object in itself. The modifier is actually linked to the cube. And maybe an even better illustration of why modifiers and space warps are so different is this one. If I create a bunch of boxes, let's just create one box here, and we'll just drag this out, shift copy it to create a few more. And in this case, I'm actually going to create a bend modifier, but I'm not going to actually do it on one of the cubes. I'm going to do it on all of them at the same time. So I'm just going to go in here, go down to modifiers, bend, and let's just test out this modifier. This, because the actual modifiers, the text is italicized, that means that it's actually instanced. It's the same modifier in all these objects. And that's actually quite easy enough to do, and I'll show you to do that in a second. Because it's instanced, you can go here and you can put in a bend angle and you can see all the boxes get bent at the same time. Now, I'm not particularly happy with the way it's bending there. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go into the sub-object of this bend modifier. I'm not really going to fiddle around with a gizmo, which is this cube here. I can reposition that if I need to. But what I'm interested in changing here is the center point of the bend. So if I look at this from the right angle, you can see this is the center point here. The cubes all sit on this home grid line here. So what I want to do is I want to move the point here down to here. So it's actually on the home grid. And that means now that they're all going to bend along the base of the cubes. And you can see, because it's here, it's causing the bend to do something weird to these cubes here. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to pull the pivot. This is the sort of pivot point for the bend out to here. So let's go back into perspective view and have a look now. And you can see we're getting a kind of nicer bend now, something a little bit more interesting. I can, as you can see, just move the center point around. And these sub-objects, they're common to, pretty much all modifiers. Each modifier has its own sub-objects. Some modifiers don't actually have any sub-objects at all because they don't need them. For instance, bend and any of the sort of geometric modifiers like twist, taper, and so on, they all have a gizmo and a center point which you can modify quite easily just by going into sub-object mode by clicking on this icon here. And when you're working with the edit mesh and edit poly modifiers, those have a lot of sub-objects, and they actually allow you to access things like the vertices, the edges, the faces, and they basically allow you to do poly modeling. So the sub-objects of those particular modifiers are extremely important. So anyway, let's get back to the point. In this case, we've got the pivot point in the right point, and now I can do a bend like this. You can see it's probably needs a little bit more sort of tessellation here on these objects to get the most out of this bend. So we'll just go in here to this box and let's see, I think it's probably height segments. Yeah, so let's just crank up the height segments. And we'll do this for all of these just to make this look a bit prettier. Box height, there we go, crank that up. There's just a couple more to go. There we are, and the last one. There it goes. So we can click on any of these objects because the modifier is instanced on all of them. And I can just change the bend angle like that. It goes all the way around. And I can change the direction. We get some craziness going on there. Okay, so that's all well and good. So, we can apply a modifier to multiple objects, which is similar to what we're doing over here with this space warp. But the difference is, if we change this angle back to, if we change this direction back to 0, and then we increase this angle, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another cube. And in this case, this wasn't part of the whole plan when this modifier was applied. And I'm going to just change the height here so it's a bit more of a cube kind of shape. And now what I want to do is I want to apply this modifier to this cube. The gizmo was actually tailored to all of these boxes. You can see the gizmo is actually the size of all of these boxes. If I put the angle back to 0, you can see it actually fits around all of these cubes. So, but it doesn't fit around this cube. So, what will happen when we try and copy this modifier and put it onto this object here? Well, let's just put the angle back. So, we can see what's going on. I've got angle snaps turned on already. I just want to rotate this cube through 90 degrees in this direction. Let's say, oops, that popped quite a large amount there. Just go over here. There we are, 90 degrees. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this modifier over to here. But I'm not actually going to do it as a copy. I'm going to do it as an instance. So just go to the modifier, right click. You can see you've got all these options here. You can rename the modifier. So if I wanted to, I could call it bend special, which is pretty cool. It allows you to give your modifiers special names. The actual name that you give, that is given to the modifier, is just a default name, and you don't have to keep that. But what we're interested in is copying it, going over to this object here, clicking in the stack, right click, and I can either paste the modifier or I can instance it. Paste instance. That's what we want. I'll just paste that. And as you can see, it's caused something quite weird to happen. The gizmo is, let's just change the angle. The gizmo is the same size and aspect ratio. It's the same scale in all dimensions as this gizmo over here. But the difference is that it's actually at 90 degrees to these objects over here. And that's because this object has been translated. So, it's not been applied to this object in the same orientation of these, and that's because this object's been rotated, so when you apply the gizmo, it gets translated with the object. So it's not an exact match. It's not as if it's in part of the same deformation system. Let's try some other things. Let's go in and change the gizmo. We'll try moving that around, and as you can see, we are moving the gizmo, but it's moving in a different plane to the gizmo over here. But you can see it is instance. It's the same gizmo, so we are actually moving it around. But you can see that the gizmo is inheriting the transform from this object, so it makes it difficult to work with. So that shows you what the difference is in a big way between modifiers and space warps. Space warps are independent. They work in world space. They don't really care about the objects that they're deforming. They're kind of oblivious to any one particular object, and they're not tailored to actually fit to the size of an object. You just create them to any size that you want, and then you bind objects to the space warp, and then they deform that object. Whereas with a modifier, it's specifically tailored to an object. It's bound to the object's transform. It's difficult to get the gizmo to actually be linked to another object. So it's not very easy to actually make a gizmo become part of a hierarchy, although it is if you know Max a little bit better on the technical side. Modifiers are great in one way, space warps are great in another way. But the only thing about space warps is a downside is there aren't really that many options. So you can only really use them for certain things, mainly for special effects. But you can actually use them as a group modifying system if you need to. Okay, so that shows you the difference. Let me just show you a few more of the space warps very, very quickly, just to give you an idea of the kind of variety that you've got here. Let's create some boxes again. Boxes show deformation pretty well. They're not particularly exciting. Let's just create a teapot as well, just to make it a little bit more interesting. And then let's just create a few more space warps. So let's create a wave. Let's create a ripple. Pop that here. There we go. And yeah, I think that'll do for now. Let's have a look at some of these modifier based ones. Maybe noise. Okay, and let's try some of these space warps out. Let's actually see what happens when we use them. Let's get all of these objects. We'll just select them here. And we use the bind to put on the ripple over here. And there you go. So ripple creates a kind of wave effect. But it's three-dimensional. It's like a stone being thrown into a pond and rippling outwards in concentric circles. We can change the amplitude on 2 axes, I believe. And as before, we can move the objects around inside the deformation field. Let me just turn off wireframe here. Makes it a little bit easier to see. You can see there's the central ripple point. There you go. Pretty cool. And you can also grab the space warp, move it around, and everything will then deform at the same time. Pretty cool. And let's just get rid of these space warp bindings very quickly. And now we'll just link them up to these other space warps. Bind these to this one. Pretty similar, but in this case, the actual ripple is just, as it were, 2-dimensional rather than being 3-dimensional. So there you go. I'll just undo that a few times. And lastly, we've got the noise. Kick that in there. Hasn't actually been set up yet. Let me just make sure that these have, yeah, they've got the binding. So let me just apply some noise deformation. Crank that up a little bit. On all 4 axes. Sorry, all 3 axes. What am I talking about there? We're not talking about 4-dimensional space quite yet. And let's just change the scale of that noise. Let's just make it smaller. You can start to see it a little bit more clearly. There you go. Just make it larger and then increase the scale here. Okay, so you can see they're all being deformed now by this noise field. A 3-dimensional noise field, which is pretty cool. There's actually a modifier. This is actually one of the modifier-like space warps. And so, you know, there's a modifier that does the same kind of thing. And you can also put up decay as well. So that actually makes the field drop off over a distance. So you can have it go like that. That may not be obvious here, but you can probably see this object's getting quite a lot of deformation. And this object here is getting very little. So we can just put that up even higher. I think you can see now there's actually a fall off here. Kind of spherical fall off based on the center of the gizmo. And the cool thing is, you can just get any other objects you want and you can make them take part in that field as well. So just create a new object, bind it in there with a space warp, and there we are. It's now in with the same deformation field. These space warps can be part of a hierarchy. They can also be animated. So if I wanted, I could have it here. And then at the end of the timeline, I could move it over here. And we'll just auto key it actually. That's probably the easiest thing to do. So I just move it back over here. And then move it up here. So there we are. It's now keyed. And you can have also multiple space warps affecting objects at the same time. Just make some of these a little bit less effective. It's actually deforming the objects quite a lot. There we go, and let's just reduce this as well. Oops, it is. Pretty huge there, isn't it? Actually, let's just increase the wavelength somewhat. There we go. And I'll turn on auto key again. And in this case, I'm going to move this a few up here. I'm also going to rotate it. So there you go. All of these objects are being affected by these space warps all at the same time. Before we wrap up, let's just show you one last feature, which is really quite cool. Just shows you some of the possibilities you have with 3ds Max. Let's create one more box. Let's go in and create a geometric deformable space warp. It's going to be an FFD box. I'm going to create it here. I think that's fine. Just going to go in, modify some of the control points to show you that, you know, it's working as per usual. Just deform that down there. Move that over there a little bit. I think that's enough. And then we'll just bind this cube into the space warp. So there you are. You can see it's getting deformed quite nicely by it. And this is the really weird thing. You can also use modifiers on space warps. So let's go in here. Let's choose a bend modifier. There we go. We've applied the bend modifier. Let's have a look where the gizmo is. Let's try moving that around. We can see it then. Because they're both the orange. It's quite difficult to see. Yeah, actually because there's control points out here, that's why it's actually created the gizmo this size. And the center point is here. I'm just going to change that, and I'm going to move it down to here. Because this is a bend, so I want it to take place from an interesting point. So let's just put it there. And now I can just change the bend angle. And as you can see, we're getting quite an interesting thing going on. We've got the freeform deformation lattice actually being deformed by a modifier. That's pretty cool. Now, I've tried out some of the modifiers, and some of them work with it, and others do not. It's a little bit hit and miss, but you know, you'll just have to experiment and see what modifiers do actually work with these space warps. But one of them I found that does work is the FFD select, and I believe that's been supplied as a way of actually passing on a subselection of control points onto a modifier above it in the stack. It's very similar to what we did with the edit mesh and edit poly modifiers, where we could select vertices and then pass those on to objects above in the stack. The only thing that we don't have here with FFDs, which is a real pity because it would make it much better, well, it's exactly the same as we have with real geometry. We don't have soft selections, which is a real pity because you can only make hard selections. So we can select these control points, pass that on to the bend modifier, and now the bend modifier only bends those control points which have been passed on to it. So let me just show you that. You can see the control points down here haven't been touched. And I can go back to here, change my selection. So it's just these rows, pass that back up to the bend modifier, and as you can see, it's only those that are actually being modified. Pretty cool all the same, though, eh? So, as you can see, if you want your deformations to be based on the object's space itself, then you'll need to use a modifier. However, if you want your objects to move around within the deformation space, and if you want the deformation to be independent of the objects, then Spacewarps are a much better bet. Remember, as a basic rule, a modifier's deformation is fixed to the object. If you move the object around, its deformation will remain the same. The deformation will move with the object and will not actually change. However, with a space warp, the deformation stays fixed within world space. So if you move the object around, it will change its deformation. And you can also move the space warp around, and that will also change the deformation on the object too. And if it's linked to multiple objects, then it'll deform all of them at the same time, which is a really cool feature. Okay, that's it for Spacewarps. Let's move on now into the next section of the DVD, where we'll make a start on a project that we'll be returning to throughout this DVD series. It's a very simple kind of go-kart model, and the idea is that we can use the skills that we learn in each DVD to build certain elements of that model that make sense with that skill set. So let's move on now and make a start on that.